There is a lake on this planet that has not seen the sun or touched the open sky in roughly 15 million years. It sits in total darkness under almost 2.5 miles of solid ice, and the water inside it stays liquid even though it is colder than the inside of your freezer. For decades, almost everyone assumed it was empty, a dead pocket of trapped water. Almost everyone was wrong. Because when Russian scientists finally drilled all the way down and broke through to the surface of that water, 3 things happened that nobody was fully ready for. The water did not sit there quietly. It came rushing up the borehole with enough force that they had 4 seconds to save their equipment. In the ice frozen to the bottom of the drill, they found genetic traces of bacteria that live in the guts of fish, in a lake where there should be no fish. And buried in that same frozen water, they pulled out a signature of something alive that matches nothing, anywhere, in any database on Earth. That lake is called Lake Vostok. And the story of what is down there, why the water tried to escape, and why much of the rest of the world begged Russia to stop drilling, is one of the strangest things hidden anywhere on this planet. So let's go down. Start with the scale, because the scale is the part your brain quietly refuses to accept. Lake Vostok is about 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. It covers around 12,500 square kilometers. To put that in something you can actually picture, it is roughly the size of a small country, or about the size of New Jersey. By the amount of water it holds, it is one of the largest lakes on the entire planet, somewhere around the 6th largest lake on Earth by volume. And you have almost certainly never seen it, never heard anyone talk about it, never seen a photo of its shoreline, because there are no photos of its shoreline. Nobody has ever laid eyes on the water. It is buried. The surface of the lake sits about 4 kilometers beneath the top of the ice. The ice above it is so deep that the lake's surface is actually below sea level, even though the ice on top of it rises almost 3,500 meters into the freezing Antarctic sky. And here is the first thing that should not make sense. At that location, on the surface, sits the coldest naturally occurring temperature ever recorded anywhere on Earth, minus 89.2 degrees Celsius, logged at the Russian Vostok station in July of 1983. This is the most hostile patch of ground on the planet, and directly underneath it, sealed away, is liquid water. How? How do you get a giant lake of liquid water under the coldest place on Earth? That single question is where this whole story begins. And the answer to it was figured out, on paper, more than 100 years before anyone had the tools to prove it. So before we go to the water, we have to understand how anyone even knew it was there. Because for a very long time, the only person who believed in Lake Vostok was a man making a prediction that sounded impossible. A Russian scientist named Peter Kropotkin first floated the idea at the end of the 19th century. His thinking was simple and a little bit beautiful. If you stack enough ice on top of something, the sheer crushing weight of all that ice generates pressure, and pressure changes the rules. Under enough pressure, the temperature at which water freezes starts to drop. Kropotkin's idea was that at the very bottom of a thick enough ice sheet, the pressure could be so extreme that the ice down there would quietly melt into liquid water, even in a place where the surface never thaws. Heat, leaking up from the rock of the planet itself, would help keep it liquid. It was a theory, just a theory, and it sat as a theory for most of a century. Another Russian, a glaciologist named Igor Zotikov, took it seriously enough to build his entire doctoral thesis around the idea in the 1960s. But thinking something is true and proving it are very different things, especially when the thing you are trying to prove is hidden under kilometers of ice in the most remote place humans have ever set foot. The first real hint came from sound. A Russian geographer, Andrei Kapitsa, ran seismic soundings near Vostok Station back in 1959 and again in 1964. He was not even looking for a lake. He was trying to measure how thick the ice was, by sending shockwaves down and timing the echoes. He gathered the data, and then he basically sat on it. He did not realize what it was telling him. It took until the mid-1990s, at a symposium in Cambridge, for Kapitsa to look back at his own old measurements and understand. The echoes had been bouncing off something. There was a flat, smooth boundary down there that behaved like the surface of water. He had recorded the proof decades earlier and not known it. Then the British added their piece. In the early 1970s, British scientists flew over the region firing radar down into the ice, and they got strange readings back, the kind of readings you would expect if there were a flat sheet of liquid water hiding underneath. And finally, the machine that closed the case was in space. In 1991, a remote sensing specialist named J.P. Ridley pointed a European satellite called ERS-1 down at the center of the Antarctic ice cap. The satellite confirmed it. There, under the ice, was a body of fresh water large enough to rank among the biggest lakes in the world. The discovery was published in the journal Nature in 1996. The theory, written down 100 years earlier, was real. And the moment it became real, it created a temptation that would haunt the next 20 years, because now there was a sealed world down there, untouched for millions of years. And the only way to find out what was inside it was to drill straight through the ice and break the seal. That decision would turn out to be far more dangerous than anyone first imagined. Here is the thing people forget. The Russians did not start drilling at Vostok to reach the lake. When the deep drilling began at Vostok Station, nobody was even sure the lake existed yet. The whole point, originally, was the ice itself. Antarctic ice falls as snow, and each year's snowfall gets buried by the next, trapping a little sample of the ancient atmosphere in every layer. Drill down far enough, and you are reading the planet's diary, backwards, 1 year at a time. The ice above Lake Vostok holds a continuous climate record, stretching back around 400,000 years. Working with French and American teams, the Russians pulled out one of the longest ice cores in the world and used it to identify the great rhythm of ice ages, 4 full cycles of glacial and warm periods locked into the frozen layers. But the deeper they drilled, the closer they got to the lake. And drilling through this much ice is not like drilling a hole in your wall. Ice under that kind of pressure does not stay open. Left alone, a borehole would slowly crush itself shut. So to keep the hole from collapsing and freezing over, the drillers filled it with a fluid, a mixture of kerosene and a chemical called freon, blended to be exactly the right density. And over the years, the amount of that fluid poured into the ice grew and grew, until roughly 60 tons of kerosene and freon were sitting in the hole above the most pristine, sealed lake on the planet. You can already feel the problem. To reach a lake that had been perfectly clean for millions of years, they had built a 60-ton column of industrial chemicals pointed straight down at it. And the drilling itself was a nightmare of bad luck. The main borehole, called 5G, got down past 2,500 meters, and then the drill got stuck and could not be pulled out. So they had to steer a new branch around it. Years later, deeper down, it happened again. A drill lost at the bottom of the hole, cables snapping, more chemicals poured in to try to free it, the whole shaft having to be deflected sideways a second time to dodge the wreckage. This is why the hole has names like 5G1 and 5G2. Each name is a scar from an accident. And yet, accident after accident, it kept going down. By the time it was finished, that single shaft, borehole 5G, had become the deepest ice borehole ever drilled in human history, plunging more than 12,300 feet straight down into the continent. It had started life decades earlier as a simple climate experiment. It ended as a record-breaking tunnel aimed at the heart of a hidden lake. The Russians were not alone in struggling. European teams drilling in Greenland with a similar kerosene and freon mixture had their own holes end in accidents at comparable depths. The deepest anyone had managed under easier conditions was around 3,000 meters. Vostok was being pushed far past that, in the coldest place on the planet. And in 1998, with the drill about 100 meters above the lake's surface, they made a decision that tells you how seriously they took the risk. They stopped, deliberately. They parked the drill and walked away for 8 years, while the world argued about whether breaking into the lake was even safe to attempt. That pause is the heart of the controversy. Other countries, watching, were not comfortable. The idea of punching through 60 tons of kerosene into a sealed ecosystem that had been isolated since before modern humans existed struck a lot of scientists as reckless. The argument simmered for years. And when the Russians finally went back to finish the job, they were not just drilling through ice. They were drilling through international objection, environmental warnings, and the very real chance that they were about to ruin the thing they were trying to study. So they engineered a trick, a clever one. The plan was never to plunge the drill into the water like a straw into a drink. The plan relied on pressure. The lake below was under enormous pressure from all that ice. The fluid in the borehole was kept at slightly lower pressure on purpose. So the theory went like this. The instant the drill kissed the surface of the lake, the higher pressure lake water would shove its way up into the hole, rising tens of meters, pushing the dirty drilling fluid up and out of the way. Then they would pull the drill, let that risen water freeze solid into a clean plug of ice, and later drill back down into that frozen plug to sample it. The lake would seal itself, in theory. What actually happened on the night of February 5th, 2012, was not quite so polite. It was just after 8 in the evening, Moscow time. The drill, turning at a depth of 3,769 meters, finally touched liquid water. The seal that had held for millions of years was broken, and the lake reacted instantly. The water did not gently rise a few meters. It surged up the borehole with real force because the pressure difference was even sharper than the calm version of the plan assumed. The drillers had a tiny window to react. They started hauling the drill assembly up almost immediately, within about 4 seconds of contact, because if they had hesitated, the rising water would have frozen around the drill in the brutal cold of the surrounding ice and locked their equipment in the hole forever. They got it out, barely, and then the lake kept coming. Water and drilling fluid mixed together flooded up the shaft. Roughly 1,500 liters of fluid gushed out into collection trays they had set up at the surface. Hundreds of meters of liquid forced up through the ice. When the winter crew measured the hole weeks later, they found that the water from the lake had climbed nearly 600 meters up the borehole before it finally froze in place. 600 meters. The lake had reached up through the wound in its ceiling and grabbed almost 600 vertical meters of the hole. Worse, when they studied the numbers afterward, they realized something they had not planned for at all. The pressure had been so intense that the drilling fluid had been driven sideways into the walls of the borehole, forcing its way into cracks in the ice. The report described it plainly. Hydraulic fracturing had occurred. Fracking, the same violent process used to crack open oil and gas wells, had happened, by accident, 2.5 miles under Antarctica. They had cracked the ice around the hole with pressure they did not fully control. And as frightening as that was, the scientists who understood the lake's chemistry knew the truly terrifying version had not even happened. Because Lake Vostok is not just a lake, it is a loaded one. And the reason it stayed liquid in the first place turns out to be the same reason it could have gone off like a bomb. Let's deal with the impossible part first. How is the water liquid at all? The average temperature of the water in Lake Vostok is around -3 degrees Celsius. That is below the normal freezing point of fresh water. It should be ice. It is not. And the reason is exactly the idea Kropotkin had over a century ago, pushed to an extreme. The weight of the ice above presses down on the lake with a pressure of around 350 to 400 bar. That is hundreds of times the pressure you feel standing on the surface of the Earth. Under that crushing load, the freezing point of the water is dragged down below zero. So the water sits there, liquid, colder than ice usually is, held in that state purely by the unimaginable weight pressing on it. A little heat leaking up from the rock below helps keep the bottom warm. Now here is what that pressure does to the air dissolved in the water, and this is where it gets dangerous. Down there, over millions of years, oxygen and nitrogen have been forced into the water in enormous quantities. The lake is estimated to hold something like 50 times more dissolved gas than a normal freshwater lake. Some of that gas is dissolved straight into the water. The rest is locked into icy structures called clathrates, where gas molecules are trapped inside tiny cages of ice, packed in like snow. They are stable down there under all that pressure. Bring them up to the surface, release the pressure, and they fall apart, dumping their gas. Think about what that means. The entire lake is, in effect, a sealed can of soda that has been shaken and compressed for 15 million years. The gas is held in solution only because of the lid of pressure sitting on top. Crack that lid the wrong way, and all of that gas wants out at once. One of the scientists involved, John Priscu from Montana State University, described the doomsday scenario in exactly those terms. If the rising water had pushed past the machinery meant to contain it and rocketed up the open borehole, which is only about 6 to 8 inches wide at the top, the result could have been a colossal geyser. Not a trickle, an eruption. Priscu's estimate of the worst case was that such a geyser could empty as much as a quarter of the lake. A quarter of one of the largest bodies of fresh water on the planet, blasting up into the Antarctic sky. He did not expect it to happen. But he knew that if it did, the sudden flood of water vapor into the atmosphere over Antarctica could mess with the continent's weather in ways nobody could predict. That is the kind of thing they were gambling with by drilling into a pressurized lake the size of a country. Even the calm version of the lake is profoundly strange. There is no light down there at all. Complete and total darkness. There is almost nothing to eat. The levels of dissolved organic carbon are extraordinarily low. The pressure is monstrous. And bizarrely, despite being sealed under 4 kilometers of ice, the lake actually has tides. As the sun and moon pull on the planet, the surface of Lake Vostok rises and falls by around 12 millimeters. A buried lake, in the dark, going through tides like a tiny hidden ocean. There is even a magnetic anomaly along one edge of it, a region more than 100 kilometers across where the magnetic field is subtly off, which some researchers suspect points to the Earth's crust being unusually thin right there. So picture the place. Pitch black, crushing pressure, freezing but liquid, starved of food, drowning in dissolved oxygen, sealed away since before our species existed. Every single one of those conditions is hostile to life, which made the next question almost absurd to even ask. Could anything actually be living down there? Because if something was alive in that, it would change what we think life is capable of. And the first clues were already frozen into the ice they had pulled out. To understand the clues, you have to understand a quiet, slow process happening at the bottom of the ice sheet. The ice above the lake is not still. It creeps along at only about 3 meters a year, but over thousands of years that adds up. As it drifts across the lake, water from the lake slowly freezes onto the underside of the ice sheet, layer by layer. This is called accretion ice. It is, in effect, frozen lake water captured and lifted into the bottom of the glacier. And critically, the Russians had been pulling up cores of this accretion ice for years before they ever touched the liquid water. They had samples of the lake, frozen, in their hands the whole time. They just had to learn how to read them. When teams studied that frozen lake ice, they did not find nothing. They found life, or at least the unmistakable fingerprints of it. A team, led by Scott Rogers, working with cores of accretion ice, sequenced the genetic material trapped inside and pulled out over 3,500 unique gene sequences. Around 94 to 95% of them came from bacteria, but the rest came from eukarya, the domain of more complex life, the branch that includes fungi, plants, and animals. Of the sequences they could actually identify, the picture was wild. There were sequences matching organisms from oceans, from soil, from glaciers, from deep-sea sediment, even from deep-sea hydrothermal vents. And then there were the truly strange matches. Some of the bacteria were the kind that live specifically in the intestines of fish, and a later study, in 2020, found a genetic sequence closest to a fish called the rock cod, a species that lives along the coast of Antarctica and survives by making its own antifreeze proteins in its blood. Stop and sit with that. In a sealed, dark, freezing lake, they were finding genetic echoes of fish gut bacteria and a cold water fish that makes antifreeze. It does not prove fish are swimming around down there, but it whispers at the possibility of a far richer, more complex ecosystem than anyone dared to assume, a buried world that might once have had, or might still have, something more than microbes. Then there were the thermophiles. Some of the most convincing organisms found in the deepest, cleanest ice were heat-loving bacteria. One of them, called Hydrogenophilus thermoluteolus, is a microbe known from hot springs in places like Japan and Yellowstone, the kind of creature that thrives in scalding water and lives by oxidizing hydrogen. Others were related to bacteria found around the boiling hydrothermal vents of the Galapagos, and to organisms pulled from deep-sea trenches rich in sulfides and methane. Why would heat-loving, vent-dwelling bacteria show up in the coldest lake on Earth? The leading idea is genuinely exciting. It suggests that the life in Lake Vostok is probably not floating in the cold, oxygen-poisoned upper water at all. It is most likely concentrated at the very bottom, in the sediments, especially near deep cracks in the Earth's crust where geothermal heat seeps up and warms the water. The bottom of the lake might be dotted with tiny warm oases, fed by the planet's own internal heat, exactly the kind of place life clings to in the deep ocean. And then, in the frozen water from the lake itself, they found the thing that still has not been explained. When Russian and French scientists analyzed the freshly frozen lake water, carefully filtering out the dozens of known contaminants, two sequences refused to match anything. One in particular, given the dry laboratory name W12310, showed less than 86% similarity to any known bacterium on Earth. They could not slot it into any branch of the bacterial family tree. They could only say that it seemed related to one other, equally mysterious sequence found earlier in the accretion ice. Both of them passed every contamination control the scientists could throw at them, which leaves a single, electric possibility hanging in the air. That down in that lake may live a form of bacterial life so isolated for so long that it has drifted into something we have never catalogued, a native of Lake Vostok and nowhere else. But the moment anyone got excited, a colder voice always cut in. Because there was one enormous problem with every single one of these discoveries, and it threatened to erase all of them. The problem, of course, was the 60 tons of kerosene. You cannot drill through a column of industrial chemicals contaminated with whatever bacteria came along for the ride from the surface, and then claim that every microbe you find at the bottom is a pristine native of the lake. The skeptics were ruthless, and they were right to be. A microbiologist named David Pierce pointed out that the old ice cores had been drilled in the 1990s to study climate, not life, so the equipment was never sterilized for biology. The DNA, he warned, could simply be contamination. Even Sergei Bulat, one of the leading Lake Vostok experts in Russia, was deeply cautious about his own results, warning that the samples were very probably riddled with microbes and tissue from the outside world. The contamination doubt cut even deeper than dirty equipment. When the Russians tested ice that had frozen directly onto the drill bit during the first breakthrough, the results came back almost mockingly. They found no clear sign of native life. Most of the microbes matched contaminants from the drilling fluid. Others matched ordinary background contamination. And here is the twist that makes the whole thing a hall of mirrors. Some of the bacteria they found were exactly the kind that eat kerosene. When you find a kerosene-eating bacterium in a sample drowning in kerosene, you cannot tell whether you have discovered a hardy lake organism or simply grown a colony of contaminants feasting on the very fluid you contaminated it with. One Russian lab head openly admitted that their mystery bacterium could, in principle, just be a contaminant living off the kerosene antifreeze. The drill bit water sample was so polluted with drilling fluid that it was, at a ratio of roughly 1:1, half lake and half chemical. Even the cleaner samples were speckled with microscopic droplets of fluid that gave the ice a milky, clouded look. The honest conclusion the scientists reached, years later, was painful. They reported that it was simply not possible, with the technique they had used, to get reliable data on the true chemical and biological makeup of the lake water. They had reached one of the last untouched places on Earth, and they had smudged the evidence on the way in. There is a small, almost human detail in all of this. A sample of liquid recovered from the borehole was eventually presented to Vladimir Putin, then the Russian Prime Minister, sealed in a case of metal and glass. He was asked, reportedly, whether he had taken a drink of the water from the bottom of the world. He said no, and he was right not to. That liquid had been pulled from the hole before the final clean breakthrough, obviously laced with drilling fluid. The most famous water on the planet, and it was too dirty to taste. So, the Russians tried again. In January of 2015, they made a second entry into the lake, at almost exactly the same depth. They tried a cleaner approach, a special probe meant to collect about a liter of water untouched by the antifreeze, but the lake fought them again. They had predicted the water might rise 30 or 40 meters up the new hole. Instead, it surged up more than 500 meters. The technology, they admitted, was simply not up to the task of collecting a clean liquid sample. The results went largely unreported. And not long after, the work was suspended for the season, this time not because of pressure or ice or accident, but because of money. The Russian government had not provided enough funding to continue. This is the part of the story where the drama is quiet, but the meaning is huge. Because by this point, the rest of the scientific world was no longer just nervous. Many of them wanted Russia to stop entirely. It is tempting to imagine a dramatic international moment. Every country slamming down a single law banning the drill. The reality was messier and, in some ways, more telling. There was no single global ban with a signature on it. What there was, instead, was a steady, mounting wall of opposition that came at the Russian project from almost every direction. Other nations, particularly the United States and Britain, tried and failed to persuade the Russians not to pierce the lake until cleaner technology existed. Environmental organizations lined up against the method. The Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, the main environmental body that sits at the Antarctic Treaty meetings, argued that drilling into Lake Vostok this way was a profoundly misguided step that endangered not just Vostok, but possibly a whole network of subglacial lakes that some scientists believed might be connected to it. Some groups went further and called for an outright ban on any scientific drilling beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, so that this hidden world could be left pristine. Their preferred argument was patience. The coalition's position was almost poetic for an environmental statement. They said it would be far wiser to start with a smaller, more isolated lake and to leave Vostok alone, so that, in their words, the lake could reveal its secrets in due course. Wait, don't rush the most precious one. Build cleaner tools first. And there was a cleaner tool, or at least a cleaner idea. The Americans and the British favored a completely different method called hot water drilling, where you melt your way down through the ice with jets of filtered, sanitized hot water instead of holding the hole open with kerosene. It leaves no chemical column behind. The Russians had real objections to it, and not all of them were excuses. At Vostok, where the surface sits at -55 degrees, Keeping that much water hot enough to drill through 4 kilometers of ice would have required a power plant generating several megawatts, which was simply not practical at such a remote camp. They also argued, reasonably, that blasting 90-degree water into a near-freezing relict lake could boil the very microbes everyone wanted to study and scramble the delicate layered structure of the water. Both sides had a point, but the optics were undeniable. As one British professor, Martin Siegert, put it, "It was extremely difficult for the Russians to convince anyone their experiment was clean when there were essentially 2 miles of kerosene to cross before reaching the lake." There was another thread running underneath the science, and the scientists themselves named it out loud: prestige. A French scientist, Jean Jouzel, who had once worked at Vostok with the Russians, was blunt about it. He felt the breakthrough, however impressive as an engineering feat, was driven heavily by national pride and a sense of competition with Britain, and that national prestige had been allowed to outweigh the scientific community's wish to preserve the lake until non-polluting technology arrived. He called it regrettable. Vostok had become, in the words of many researchers, the crown jewel of Antarctica, the most scientifically priceless lake on the continent. And the worry was that the crown jewel had been opened first. And roughly, precisely because it was the crown jewel, and getting there first was a prize in itself. While the argument raged over Vostok, the alternative approach quietly proved itself elsewhere. American scientists used a clean hot water drill to enter a different, much smaller Antarctic lake called Lake Willans in early 2013, and they did it carefully, filtering and sterilizing their water, treating their instruments with ultraviolet light. Willans was a different kind of target, only about 60 square kilometers across and a mere 10 meters deep, nothing like the giant trench of Vostok. But that was the point. It was small, it was manageable, and they could reach it without leaving a chemical scar. They confirmed a real, living subglacial water system down there, measured its faint salinity and its temperature hovering just below freezing, and pulled up cores of the grey, structureless mud from the lake floor. British teams set their sights on another lake, Lake Ellsworth, using the same hot water method. The contrast was stark. The future of exploring this hidden underworld was going to be clean, sterile, and patient. Vostok had been the loud, contaminated, history-making first attempt, and the rest of the world had decided, in practice if not in a single signed law, that it was not the way to do it again. And yet, for all the contamination and the controversy, the reason any of this mattered, the reason scientists were willing to fight this hard over a lake nobody can see, has almost nothing to do with Antarctica. It has to do with other worlds entirely. Look up, far past the ice. Jupiter has a moon called Europa. Saturn has a moon called Enceladus. Both of them are wrapped in thick shells of ice. And underneath those shells, scientists are increasingly convinced, are oceans of liquid water, kept warm not by the distant sun, but by heat generated inside the moons themselves. A dark, sealed ocean of liquid water, trapped under a deep crust of ice, warmed from below, isolated from the sky. Does that sound familiar? It should. It is almost exactly what Lake Vostok is. Vostok is the closest thing we have on our own planet to the conditions on those frozen moons. It is a rehearsal. If we can prove that life survives in the dark, cold, high-pressure, oxygen-rich water under the Antarctic ice, then the case for life surviving in the oceans of Europa and Enceladus gets dramatically stronger. The drill at Vostok was never really just about Antarctica. It was a test run for how you search for life on another world, conducted on the only place on Earth weird enough to stand in for one. And the lake has more secrets than just its biology. Lake Vostok sits in a deep scar in the planet's crust, a long, steep-sided trench that geologists believe is a rift zone, the kind of feature you see in the great rift valleys of East Africa or under Lake Baikal in Siberia. Places where the Earth's crust is being pulled apart. On the bed of the lake lies a layer of sediment around 70 meters thick, And that sediment is a time capsule, because it could hold a record of the climate and the life of Antarctica from before the ice ever formed. Remember, Antarctica was not always a frozen wasteland. Tens of millions of years ago, when it was still joined to Australia, this continent had a tropical to subtropical climate, with rainforests and marsupials living on it. Lake Vostok's basin may have existed before the Great Freeze. The mud at the bottom of that lake might be holding fossils and chemistry from a green Antarctica, sealed and preserved under the ice ever since. There is even a subtle correction hidden in the timeline, the kind of detail that makes the place feel alive. We say the lake has been sealed for 15, maybe 25 million years. That is true of the lid, the seal, the isolation from the sky. But the water itself is not all ancient. Studies suggest the lake's water is constantly, slowly cycling, freezing onto the ice above and being replaced by meltwater over thousands of years, so that the entire volume of the lake may effectively be replaced roughly every 13,000 years. The truly old water, the genuinely ancient stuff, is probably only down in the sediment at the very bottom. So Vostok is both unimaginably old and quietly renewing itself at the same time, an ancient vault with fresh water moving through it, which means the deepest, oldest secrets are exactly where the drill has never reached, in the mud at the bottom, far below the thin top layer the Russians barely sampled. To grasp how much water is actually sitting down there, consider this. The water held inside Lake Vostok is estimated to be enough to fill the Grand Canyon and then keep going, overflowing it by at least a quarter. That is what is balanced on top of the drill. And the lake is not even a single smooth pool. In 2005, scientists found an island sitting in the middle of it. The next year, they reported 2 more smaller lakes nearby under the same ice cap, given the names 90 degrees east and Sovetskaya, with the suspicion that all of them might be quietly linked by a web of buried rivers. The map of the underworld kept getting more crowded the closer anyone looked. And the strangest twist of all is that Lake Vostok is not alone. When this story began, scientists thought subglacial lakes might be rare. They were spectacularly wrong. We now know Antarctica is riddled with them. There are hundreds of lakes hidden under that ice, and the count keeps climbing. As recently as 2025, a single decade of data from a European satellite called Cryosat revealed 85 more previously unknown lakes, pushing the total number of known subglacial lakes in Antarctica up towards 700 or 800, and these lakes are not all still. Many of them are active, filling and draining over months and years, and some of them are linked together in vast hidden networks, with water flowing between them through rivers buried under the ice. There is, beneath the white silence of Antarctica, an entire secret plumbing system of lakes and rivers in the dark, a whole drowned landscape we have only just begun to map. Lake Vostok is simply the largest and most famous chamber in a buried world we did not even know was there until a few decades ago. So here is where we end up. The Russians did something genuinely extraordinary. After drilling for more than 2 decades through over 2 miles of the hardest, coldest, most punishing ice on Earth, they reached down and touched a lake that had been sealed away since before there were human beings to wonder about it. It was a feat of engineering and sheer stubbornness that deserves real respect. And in the ice frozen from that lake, they found fingerprints of life that should not be there. Heat-loving bacteria, fish gut microbes, the genetic ghost of an antifreeze fish, and a bacterium that matches nothing else on Earth. But they also reached it through 60 tons of kerosene, cracked the ice with accidental fracking, watched the lake erupt almost 600 meters up their borehole, and contaminated their own samples so badly that, in the end, they could not say for certain what truly lives down there and what merely hitched a ride on the drill. The rest of the world, watching, decided that the way it had been done was a mistake worth never repeating, and turned instead to clean, patient, sterile methods on smaller, lesser lakes. Vostok was opened. The seal was broken. And we still do not have a clean answer. That is the part that lingers. We drilled all the way to the bottom of the world, to the surface of an alien lake, and we came back up with our hands dirty and the central questions still wide open. Is there life in Lake Vostok? Real, native, thriving life, evolved alone in the dark for millions of years? We genuinely do not know. We got close enough to taste it, almost literally, and we could not be sure of what we found. The truly ancient water and the sediment that might hold the real answer are still down there, untouched, waiting in the dark under 4 kilometers of ice. And maybe that is exactly as it should be, for now. Because somewhere under the coldest place on the planet, sealed beneath the ice, there is a lake the size of a country that has its own tides, its own pressure-bent rules, and possibly its own private branch of life found nowhere else in the universe. It is a mystery the size of New Jersey, hidden under 2.5 miles of ice, and it is still keeping most of its secrets. We will get there cleanly, eventually. And when we finally pull up a sample, no one can doubt. It may not just tell us what lives at the bottom of the world. It may tell us what is waiting in the oceans of distant moons. We just have to be patient enough to reach it the right way.